Welcome to Points of View, a discussion of issues regarding persons with disabilities, moderated by Doug Usiak.
Today's panelists are Heather Randolph, Independent Living Specialist, Independent Living of Niagara County; Todd Vaarwerk, Director of Advocacy and Public Policy, Western New York Independent Living; and James Moody, Director, Independent Living of the Genesee region.
Welcome. It's been 35 years since a little law called the Rehabilitation Act was amended, which included a title called Independent Living, Title VII to be a matter of fact, I guess. I'll throw it out to you guys. What is Title VII Independent Living? Todd?
Well, Title VII creates a nationwide program called Independent Living, where people with disabilities are helping themselves in achieving community integration and helping them with the power of choice.
That's an awful big word, the power of choice. So, Jim, how does that break down to the average individual? I mean, in this country, most people feel that they have choice anyway. So, you know, what was the country dealing with prior to 1978 or something?
Well, the civil rights movement in the 1960s really brought out an opportunity that people felt as though they needed and did not have. And so with the opportunity of choice that we have today, everyone has an opportunity to be the person that they want to be. And in that, they have choices that they can make given the situation that they are in personally. So the independent living philosophy or movement allows people the opportunity to decide for themselves what is most important for them to live a happy life, if you will, in our society.
Yeah, but how does that really play out, Heather? I mean, you think about it prior to 1978, I guess for those of us who are old enough to remember, you know, the civil rights, we saw the riots in the street, we saw the hangings and the beatings that were going on, we saw the information the FBI was holding and withholding regarding the struggle of people of color. What was it that people with disabilities, I mean, seriously, I don't think anybody in this country would ever say the person with a disability was denied something.
Well, I guess from my not being that old and only seeing newsreels and stuff, I would say that it was the time where people with disabilities were held in seclusion, that weren't even allowed to see like the light of day. They had no voice of their own to be able to express their likes or dislikes or anything.
Incarceration based on disability.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Well, the only law prior to that did anything to promote community integration was the Architectural Barriers Act in '68. And that only covered federal buildings. So you're talking about whole parts of our way of life that were physically and programmatically inaccessible to people with disabilities. Houses, businesses, buses, movie theaters. You pick it, there was probably a problem with a person with a disability attempting to access it. So forget about getting a job. Forget about thinking about getting married or having a family or any of those goals that were part of the American dream. We had to just deal with how we could get basic needs met. And at that point in the 70s, I mean, and I'm not any older than Heather is, but I know that it was the medical model that did everything when I was a kid. It was about what the doctors told me I was ready for. Independent living moves beyond that model. It becomes about me saying what I want to be ready for and building steps to make that happen.
Well, what's the problem with that? I mean, if you've got somebody looking out for your own good, Jim, what's a big deal? You know, if you're concerned about something, certainly having that doctor behind you saying this isn't, how can that hurt?
Well, if you go back to the 1960s, it was a period of exclusion, and now we are a period of inclusion. And if you're talking about the opportunities that people have a right to choose for themselves, if someone else, whether it be a doctor or a family member or a person in the community, is making a decision for you, it doesn't make you feel any better than it would if you're making the choice for yourself. So it really, the inclusive opportunities that we have as individuals with disabilities and even without disabilities, we have an opportunity to join together now as one body of people and to be able to be people of whatever it is that we want to be in life.
But you're not being denied participation in, are you? I mean, because you've got a couple steps that you have to get through, somebody helping you up with the wheelchair, a couple big, strong guys picking up your chair. You know, because the fact that you can't read a menu because you're blind, I mean, you know, somebody can read that to you. I mean, what's the problem there?
That's not independence.
Well,
It's dependence on people to do it for you.
Look, Doug, it's about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It always has been. Those three things it wasn't a plot to say we were deliberately denied them. It was the society we lived in that just wasn't ready. Having a couple of big, strong guys carry my chair up a couple of steps is great, but where did the big, strong guys come from? In the late 70s, it was my responsibility to bring two big, strong guys to carry me up those steps. And if I didn't have access to that resource, for whatever reason, I was out of luck. Yeah, survival of the fittest, man, whatever. So were we purposefully denied it by policy and intent? No. But people with disabilities are the only minority that requires physical changes in the environment in order to achieve equality. And if independent living centers started in 1978 when they wrote the regs for the Rehab Act in 73, took 5 years and a protest, the largest takeover of federal office space, or the longest takeover of federal office space in history. From 1978 to the next major civil rights milestone was the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990. The Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990 is 22 years old, and we still have battles to fight.
I was just going to say, Todd, it led me right into my thought that we all know that with the ADA, the American with Disabilities Act, that was signed by George Bush in 1990, just because the law is there and the act is there doesn't mean that everything is followed based on exactly what the act says. So we need advocates. We need everyone to advocate for each other to be able to get what we need for people with disabilities throughout our country.
So the inadvertent act of omission impedes on the individual's right to participate. Heather, would you say that would be what we're saying here?
You know, I guess my first thought is, can you repeat the question? But then I'm thinking about like just limited access and what Todd had said about having to find people to carry his wheelchair instead of a ramp being built.
Okay.
You know, like,
Yeah,
you don't know unless you know, right?
Okay. We'll take a break here and we'll be back and we'll talk about how does this independent living title impact on those rights or enforces them. See you in a minute.
Today, people with disabilities are participating fully in the social and economic life of New York State. In large measure, this is true because of the work of an independent living center in your community. The New York State Independent Living Council is dedicated to promoting the independent living philosophy and to facilitating access to independent living services. For more information on the council or about your nearest independent living center, call toll-free 1-888-469-7452.
Are you looking for new ideas to help you sell? Need a presentation that must compel? Have a message you wish to dispel? Or an important story you need to tell? Are you exploring new ways to communicate, to motivate, to educate, or demonstrate? Or are you searching for creative concepts to help you entertain, promote your brand name, to effectively train, or launch a new web domain name? Then focus on Creative Concept Studios and see the possibilities.
Welcome back. We're having a discussion about independent living 35 years later, and we've just sort of talked about the philosophical advancement of independent living and the elimination of barriers within the community for people with disabilities to be able to participate equally. And now what I'd like to explore within Title VII itself is the ways that all of that gets implemented, you know, the way that that flows from the federal government to the state government to the local areas of which we as individuals will feel and realize what and how independent living impacts us. So I'd like to start with this first thing called spills. The statewide plan for independent living, Todd, right? What's that all about?
Well, independent living was one of the first services developed by the federal government that from top to bottom said, you have to listen to the needs of your people. The state plan for independent living is the federal government's way of ensuring that each state is doing what the community needs with its independent living dollars. The state plan is created by the people with disabilities within a state and managed by a council called the Statewide Independent Living Council, or SILC, which contains a minimum of 50% or more members with disabilities who are going to oversee the way the money is spent.
But isn't that just another way of the government telling us what to do anyway?
It's the exact opposite. The government's going to say, look, we're going to allocate by formula a certain amount of money for independent living, but we're not going to tell you what to do with it. You guys are going to write us a plan and tell us what you're going to do with it. We may have some approval power on some of the spending points, but the plan comes from you, not from us.
So it's the individuals around the state that come together and they actually put together a plan on how funds are going to be used.
Yep.
Now, the other piece of that, and I don't know, is this included, is the operations for independent living centers. Is that covered in the plan?
Well, it's Part C, which means there is money allocated to run independent living centers, but the independent living centers are going to operate on something that they refer to as standards and assurances. And once again, the federal government went a completely different direction. The federal government, in dealing with the disabled community when they created independent living, said, okay, you're going to tell us what an independent living center looks like. And they wrote a set of standards and assurances that says if you're going to get funding to operate an independent living center under Part C of Title VII, as they call it, you're going to need to abide by these standards and assurances.
So what do these centers actually look like, Jim?
Well, I'll give you a feel for, a center in Batavia, actually, which is where I come from. We have 4 core services that we provide to anyone with a disability, and that could be anything from peer counseling for folks that need to talk about whatever it is they need to talk about. Also independent living skills, budgeting as an example, or cooking, or whatever the individual need may be of the person with a disability. Also information and referral is an important core service, and individual advocacy as well, helping the person with a disability get what they need in the community. Those are the 4 core services. And then built on that are other services such as systems advocacy and actually communicating to the community what independent living is and how important it is for the people in our society. And then there's other programs that are built around that based on the needs of the community.
Now, who oversees and directs these various programs and services? Is this like a McDonald's franchise, or is it a state-run agency?
No.
Heather, what are we talking about?
No.
We're talking about peer-run agencies. We're talking about individuals with disabilities overseeing the programs that help people with disabilities, that assist them in living independently.
And every center
Go ahead.
is 31 flavors. It's like Baskin Robbins. Every center does something a little different because their community dictates what the priorities are for the centers outside of those 4 core services.
And most every center has either a council or a board of directors that would oversee the operations, the fiscal responsibilities, the responsibilities of making sure that the goals and objectives are met from the funding that is received for that center.
Is that a paid board or what?
No, volunteer. They're not paid. The board and council are not paid. It's a group of people that come together of their own free will to guide and direct the centers themselves.
Well, and again, the federal government wanted to make sure that this was controlled by people with disabilities themselves. So they said one of the standards and assurances is 50% of your staff, 50% of your board of directors, like Jim is talking about, and 51% of the management of any given independent living center must be people with disabilities.
They must be people with disabilities.
It must be people with disabilities.
And what's the purpose for that, Jim?
Well, the purpose is to assure that it is a peer-run organization, that there are people with disabilities actually dictating and following through with the responsibilities that they've been given from the state and federal level to assure that the processes and the procedures are being followed and so forth, and that the community is served appropriately.
So Heather, are we talking about a clubhouse where people with disabilities come together, sit down, talk, have a cigarette, drink coffee, eat donuts?
No, it's peers coming together and sharing their experience. I had that happen, and this is what I did. This is how I can help you. It's not about just hanging out and smoking cigarettes and drinking coffee, but it's about actually achieving a goal, a specific goal. You know, Jim mentioned budgeting. I thought of teaching someone how to use a smartphone, use the calendar in the smartphone so they can keep their appointments as an independent living skill. You know, there's a goal being accomplished so that they can further the quality of the life that they want, that they choose, that we choose.
But let's go back to that whole clubhouse mentality thing. If there was a group of consumers that said one of our biggest needs is we never get a chance to get out of the house, we want to be able to have somewhere to go to talk about things that are common to us and have a cup of coffee, an independent living center can provide a space for them to do that. But that's not its primary purpose.
It's not its primary purpose to do what? You just mentioned was peer support.
Well, but it's not its primary purpose to be a place for people with disabilities to hang out and smoke cigarettes and not do anything productive.
Well, we offer support groups, you know, where they can drink coffee, can't smoke cigarettes at the support group, but come together to share their experience in order to integrate outside into the community, not stay stuck in a clubhouse.
And if I could bring it back a little bit to the
whole... you can bring it back. We'll bring it back after this break, and we'll explore the philosophical implementation of independent living in the community. See you in a minute.
Today, people with disabilities are participating fully in the social and economic life of New York State. In large measure, this is true because of the work of an independent living center in your community. The New York State Independent Living Council is dedicated to promoting the independent living philosophy and to facilitating access to independent living services. For more information on the council or about your nearest independent living center, call toll-free 1-888-469-7452.
Are you looking for new ideas to help you sell? Need a presentation that must compel? Have a message you wish to dispel? Or an important story you need to tell? Are you exploring new ways to communicate, to motivate, to educate, or demonstrate? Or are you searching for creative concepts to help you entertain, promote your brand name, to effectively train, or launch a new web domain name? Then focus on Creative Concept Studios and see the possibilities.
Welcome back. We're talking about independent living, how it relates to the community, how it's being implemented by law. And Jim, you were about to say something before we had a break as to the services that are being implemented by independent living centers.
I was just going to mention that, yes, there are a lot of activities that go on at an independent living center. However, we need to recognize that all of those activities flow right back to an independent living philosophy, which helps individuals with disabilities to move forward in what they want to do with their own personal lives. And some of that includes the group work and the learning skills and so forth, but it's who they want to become as an individual in society.
Now, the state plan for independent living that directs the allocation of the funds and how they're going to be used, and centers for independent living, the implementation of services and programs for people with disabilities. Where does that lead the community, the state, the country? Where does that lead us, Heather?
It leads us into being a part of the community, leads us forward.
But it also, we forget that an important, I mean, Jim mentioned it earlier, an important segment of independent living is community advocacy. We're not just there ideally to be a permanent service system. We are, in essence, as an advocate once told me when I first got this job, our job is to put ourselves out of business. So a very important part of what we're doing with this money is that the community is going out and working for the change it wants to see in the community. And it's very community specific. If the biggest change the community wants to see is an accessible movie theater, then an independent living center is going to help advocate for that to happen. If a segment of the community has a problem with the way their education system works, you're going to have advocates that are going to work with the community members to make sure that that happens. A very important part of the federal funding for independent living is providing the list of what the people with disabilities in the community say they want changed in the community. We provide them with a list of what we're going to do in any given year, the kind of things that we're going to target and work on.
Now, if I understand what we're saying here, we're talking about community organizations that are being given funding in order to activate people with disabilities to be part of the community. Now, Jim, you mentioned 4 core services. Does that, all that activity is boiled down, restricted to, as you said, peer counseling, independent living services, referral?
Absolutely not, because independent living centers as an entity is a very collaborative organization, not only with the people that come into a center and become part of the center as a peer-run organization, but also in the community as a collaborative member of different agencies within the community. And within that, you get involved as an independent living center in items that perhaps will become part of who we are as independent living centers, but not necessarily a core service. And I'll give you an example. In the Batavia Center, we work a lot with the older adult population, because the older adult population is made up of a number of people with disabilities and will continue to grow, as will the aging baby boomer population. So we do a number of things in the healthcare arena and with the older adult population that perhaps is not part of who we are as a core service, but expands who we are in the community so that we can get out there and create community change and community opportunity for the people who we serve.
And what kind of activity that you do as an employee of an independent living center, Heather? How is it that you contribute to this mission of improving lives?
I think on the more so on the individual basis. Like I can't. I'm asked that question often, and I'm not really able to put it into a nutshell. Like I can say the 4 core services and I can describe them, but it seems like I do a lot outside that scope. I do a lot of individual advocacy with housing, with the way that housing rolls out, with the funding, with rent control, and HUD. I was on the phone with HUD yesterday for 2 hours. There's work incentives for people that work that receive Social Security that parlay over into housing.
Well, it makes a quick question for me. Why do we have to provide work incentives to people with disabilities if we have eliminated barriers so that they can work? Why do we have to add more incentives?
My description of that is that it makes it, sometimes when you have a disability, going to work can be challenging. When there's incentives, it makes it more palatable.
Wait, that presupposes that we've gotten rid of the barriers to disability employment.
And just because they can work, doesn't mean they will work. You know, individuals with disabilities, like others who do not have disabilities, need support from their fellow man or their fellow woman. And the Independent Living Center is there to help people with disabilities get employment in this workplace so that they don't have to do it themselves, so that they can get the supports they need, resume writing or job search or whatever the case may be, to get the employment started for them. Because yes, they can do it, but they won't necessarily do it themselves unless they have someone walking that path with them.
Now, my understanding, there's also a big push to deinstitutionalize individuals.
Absolutely. institutionalization is always more expensive than living in the community. I mean, sometimes by a factor of 10. Even if you count the entire work that an independent living center does in a year, you can see one independent living center save tens of millions of dollars.
Yeah, but aren't we paying millions of dollars to run those centers?
No, we're not. To give you an example, in New York, the entire state budget for independent living is, say, $13 million. We can save the state by keeping people out of nursing homes and institutions. My center, as an example, upwards of 70 million.
70 million.
Mm-hmm.
So a return of 7 to 1.
Yep.
Now, for individuals who need to access independent living, or who are interested in that, I mean, you know, is there a way to find these centers within the community?
Well, in New York, there definitely is. I mean, one of the things in the state plan that where you're going to tell them how you're going to spend the money is you're going to talk about how you're going to outreach to the community to let them know that these services are available, and how you're going to reach the people that would be less likely to approach an independent living center because of geography or cultural diversity
And
or whatever.
You can always Google Centers for
Independent Living.
Right. All right. Well, we're run out of time, and just remember, folks, independent living is education for people with disabilities, education for the community. Why? To empower the person with a disability to take control of their own lives so that they can become equal members of the community. You have any more questions, give me a call or come back next week. See you then.
Points of View is presented by the New York State Independent Living Council, Incorporated, in cooperation with the Catskills Center for Independence, Fingerlakes Independence Center, Independent Living of Niagara County, and Western New York Independent Living. For the location of the Independent Living Center in your area, call toll-free 1-888-469-7452.